Welcome back to another round of Atheist Bible Study Night. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about two things. One, a literary technique which Mark is using to structure his story. And two, we're going to start talking about the problematic relationship that Jesus had with the Old Testament law. So, first, a structure that Mark is using to structure his story. If you'll notice, what Mark does is Mark tends to cluster stories of a particular theme together. So, like for example, the last couple of weeks we've been talking about stories having to do with healing and sickness, things like this, right? We're going to start talking about another cluster of stories, which talk about Jesus' relationship to the law. So, and you'll notice how these are kind of like bunched and clustered together. But there's even a more formal structure to it than that. So let's go over to the chalkboard and let me diagram it out for you. Okay, I want you to notice how Mark is treating the disciples here. How do the disciples work? Notice in 1:16, Jesus hasn't called all of his disciples yet. He's passing by the sea. He saw Simon and his brother, and Jesus said to them, "Follow me. I will make you fishers of men." So you've got Simon and his brother and a few other apostles. What happens next is Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, and then there's lots of healing stories. We talk about the leper, the paralytic, all this stuff, right? So Simon is kind of being used here as a mascot. He's like the mascot. He's like the patron saint of the sick, right? So there's going to be a parallelism here. So in 2:13, Jesus is going to go call some more disciples, and Mark really lets us know that he knows what he's doing here by saying once again. Look at verse 2:13. Once again he went out to the sea. He saw Levi sitting at the customs post, and he said to him, "Follow me." Now notice the parallelism with the first call of the disciples. Both of them happen at the sea. Keywords there: follow me. And the disciple that's like being introduced here is also going to be used as a mascot. What is Levi going to be a mascot of? Simon and his brother are mascots of like the sick. Levi is going to be a mascot of the sinners. Why is that? Well, Levi is sitting at the customs post. He is a tax collector. Now, I'll talk about later why tax collectors are so scurrilous and classed with sinners. But suffice it to say for now, Levi is a sinner, and we're going to have lots of stories about Jesus, sinners, and the relationship to the law. So you can see what Mark is doing here. Okay, so Mark is, he introduces a few apostles, which are symbolic of that phase of Jesus' ministry, or that aspect of Jesus' ministry. And then he introduces some new disciples, and introduces a new aspect of Jesus' ministry. So, in the Gospel of Mark, the apostles really they don't stand out as personalities so much. I mean, Simon later on acquires some personality, and of course Judas Iscariot shows some personality. But by and large, for the most part, the rest of them are really not. They don't stand out as individuals, really. They're kind of like used as mascots or as patron saints or as kind of symbolic of aspects of Jesus' ministry here. So it's kind of interesting how Mark structures this story. So, since we're introduced to a disciple who is a sinner, and it is very significant that Jesus, just as it's significant that Jesus touches the leper, really gets in contact with the sick. It's very significant that Jesus calls as one of his disciples a sinner. All right? And we're going to see lots of stories about sinners and Jesus being accused of being a sinner and things like this, right? Okay, so let's talk about for a minute why are tax collectors sinners. Now, this is a very timely topic, right? I mean, it's April 15th is looming. I've got a big check to write, and I hope you don't either. But, it's that time of year, right? But in the Roman Empire, taxes were not collected like this, all right? The Roman Empire had a system of collecting taxes called tax farming. Now, the office of tax collector was bought and sold, kind of like McDonald's franchises was. So it's like you paid a big bribe/fee to the magistrate, and he gave you the right, he gave you a territory, and he gave you the right to collect taxes in a certain region. And he, of course, gave you proper backup in terms of, enough flat feet and muscle to, break kneecaps and legs and things like this in order to effectively collect the taxes, because it kind of operated on the Sopranos principle, okay? Each tax collector was given a quota, And as long as you shipped off to the magistrate your quota every month, right? As long as your envelope isn't light, all is well in the world. That's all you have to do. Just keep those envelopes of money coming. But if your envelope is light, then you personally have to make up the difference. So it's very much in your best interest not to make that envelope light, because you could quickly go broke this way if you weren't an effective tax collector. Now, the cool thing is, if you are a tax collector, once you've collected your quota, you can still keep collecting money. Collect as much money as you want. Anything you collect over your quota, you get to keep yourself. So that's cool, right? And this is how tax collectors they made their money. Now, as you can imagine, this system led to rampant corruption among the tax collectors, and there was a high degree of, a very high motivation for tax collectors to become corrupt, and this is why they're really classed with sinners in the New Testament, and especially in a conquered province, they really were resented, and this is why they're sinners. So it's very, very significant that Jesus Christ went to these kind of people, this class, and chose a disciple from among this class. Okay? Now, Jesus, this has been a point of contention in some of the other videos, but Jesus had a completely new conception of righteousness that it really deserves to be brought out and maintained. I'm going to go step by step here very slow because it has been a point of contention. So the first start of this, Jesus gives us a parable to give us a metaphor for his relationship to the law, patching an old code. So is Jesus' relation to the law, is he just coming to kind of patch up an old code? Is he a reformer, or is he like a paradigm buster? Is he bringing in a whole new thing? Well, we'll see. But let's first talk about this parable, because I think it's very interesting to see how much you can just draw just from a few words. Okay? Let's compare how Mark and how Luke talk about this patching here. Okay, now I want you to while we're reading this, I want you to keep your eye on two different balls here. First of all, what these things have in common and what these things have in difference. Okay? One of the things they have in common is something is going to get torn. Okay, as we're reading through here, I want you to ask yourself, what gets torn? And what is the reason for the tear? Okay? You see Mark and Luke both answer these two questions differently. What gets torn and what is the reason for the tear? Okay, so let's read Mark first. No one sews a piece of unshrunken cloth on an old garment. If he does, its fullness pulls away from the new and the old, and the tear gets worse. All right? So in Mark, what gets torn is the old garment. And the reason that it gets torn is that the new cloth is shrinking. And as it shrinks, it's tearing the old tear. And the old tear is getting worse. Okay? On to Luke. Luke, no one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Okay, in Luke, what's getting torn is a new garment. Remember, in Mark, it was the old garment that was getting torn. And the reason the new garment's getting torn is because you're cutting it up to patch an old garment. Right? If he does, it will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. So there's a completely different explanation for why the tear is happening, completely different explanation for why it is inappropriate to patch the new with the old in Luke as it is in Mark. Now, why is this? This is very significant. And what makes it even more significant is that Luke copies word for word, letter for letter, about 90% of Mark. So whenever Luke and Mark differ from each other, this is really a clue that something interesting is going on. Okay? Now, what you might think is, one plausible explanation for this is that both Mark and Luke are retelling the story, but the original version of the story had a tear in it, but the tear wasn't necessarily of the old garment, and maybe the original story just didn't even have an explanation for why the tear took place. Right? Well, in point of fact, in 1946, we discovered another gospel called the Gospel of Thomas. And it also has a version of this patch story in it, which fits the bill to a T. All right? So let's take a look at what Thomas says. Thomas is short and sweet. An old patch is not sewn onto a new garment, since it would create a tear. You notice, very mysterious. Why would an old patch create a tear on a new garment? both Mark and Luke come up with different, conflicting explanations for why this happens. Okay, so that's a clue. So scholars, this is one of the reasons why scholars believe that this particular verse in Thomas, okay, most scholars believe that Thomas is way younger than Mark. Mark was written before Thomas. But most scholars also believe that parts of Thomas, individual verses in Thomas, reflect an older stratum, a more primitive version of the saying, so probably closer to what Jesus actually said. And this is one of the ones where it's probably the version in Thomas is closer to what Jesus actually said than what was in Mark. And this is the reason why scholars think so. Why would there be two conflicting explanations for this tear? Well, probably Mark looked at this verse and came up with one explanation for the tear. Luke independently looked at this verse and came up with another explanation for the tear. And, both of them kind of patched up the tear in their own way.